you want to interrupt me, feel free to do it. So as the title says, I'm going to talk about Wutun language. It's a small language and an understudied language that is spoken in northwest China in Qinghai province. And so for this talk, I kind of put together two different studies that I have conducted on this language. I was working on Wutun during my postdoc at Prague Universitat, so just before coming here to Prague. And so we will look at the sociolinguistic situation of the language, also at its lexicon. And yeah, we will discuss about contact dynamics and vitality. So let me first, oh, sorry, it doesn't work. Okay, I can use this one. Okay, so let's see some maps before. So from the administrative point of view, we are here in the Qinghai area, but from the cultural and linguistic point of view, we are in Amdo, Tibet. So one of the three linguistic, cultural, and language region of the Chinese Tibetosphere. And so Amdo encompasses the area of Qinghai, Gansu, and the northern part of Sichuan. So Amdo is also known as a Sprachbund, and so here languages from the Turkic family, Mongolic, Chinese, and Tibetan have developed similar features. And in this area, Amdo Tibetan was the cultural and the linguistic model. So just to give you an idea, so of where the Wutun village here is so we are in the Qinghai province. Xining is the capital of the Qinghai province. We are more or less 150 to 100 kilometers from Xining. And so as you can see, the Wutun village is on the bank of a tributary river of the Yellow River. And so as I will say for the map, so the Wutun village is also close to Longwu, that is the center of this Tibetan prefecture. So the village is in a rural area, but is very close to a urban center. And all the other villages, Bonang, Gazari, Gomari, Nyentufu, etc., are villages where Mongolic languages are spoken. So, so as I told you, Wutun is a small language. It is spoken by more or less 4,000 people. As I told you, the area where it is spoken, it is called Wutun in Chinese. Wutun means the village of the 5 posts. As we will see, this is related to the history of the region that was an area where Chinese and Mongolic garrisons settled down. But it has also a Tibetan name, Sangeshon, the Valley of the Lion. It is classified as a Chinese language, in particular as a distinct variety of Northwest Mandarin. It is not intelligible nor to Chinese language or to Tibetan, but it is strongly influenced by Tibetan, and then we will see some features. Wutun is a technical term. It is used in academia, but people from the village just call their language our language. So in Wutun is non-Dehua. And they are also not officially recognized. The group is not officially recognized, not even the language. They are part of this kind of umbrella minority that we find across these regions of Qinghai, Gansu. They are called Tu people. And they basically are Buddhist and Mongolic speaking people. But the Wutun are, yes, they are Buddhist, but they speak a language that is not Mongolic. In these decades, they actually managed to change their ID, also because they identify themselves as Tibetan. And so they changed their ID, the status from Tu minority to Tibetan minority. So maybe in 10 years, they won't be classified anymore in this way. So yeah, some pictures to give you an idea of the village. As you can see, it's a kind of Tibetan style village, as we can see in many villages in this area. Yes, this is the river, the valley, and the mountains surroundings. The village is famous for 2 Buddhist temples. They are a tourist attraction for foreigners, for Chinese people, but also for simple Buddhist believers. And this is one of the typical houses that was on the occasion of the Tibetan New Year. And we will talk about it later, but the village is very famous for the production of Tanka painting, so this Tibetan Buddhist art. So now let's first listen to the audio files to give you an idea of the language. And this is like a female. Okay, so then let's see some features of the language. So as I told you, this language is a variety of Northwest Mandarin, and we can see this in, oh, sorry. Yeah, it's okay. We can see this in the morphemes. So for example, I don't know if any one of you is familiar with Chinese. Maybe Veronica studied a little bit. Okay. Yeah, so we can see morphemes. Okay.
Chinese, modern Chinese. Yeah.
Okay, so we can recognize, for example, ma for horse, younger, that is the numeral with the classifier, but ren for person in example number 2. But then when we look at the grammatical organization of the sentence, this is very similar to Tibetan. So to say I have 2 horses, we have an existential at the end, we have an oblique case. We have the numeral just right after the noun, while in Chinese languages we just find it before. And yes, another feature, interesting feature is this tera, that is a plural. And so Wutun was in contact with Bonan in the past. So the Bonan village is very close to Wutun, but basically now when Wutun communicate with Bonan people, they speak Tibetan, but historically was in contact with Bonan. And that has 2 kinds of plural, a paucal and a plural for a bigger amount of people, but still limited. And so also Wutun has this feature. So in the sentence, the people in this village, so a lot of people, but still limited, are very good. They use this kind of plural suffix. The other examples are to show you that so Wutun has evidentiality. That is a feature that is usually not developed in Chinese languages. So here you can say for like they shout, we have sensory inferentiality. And in the example number 4, here the person is talking about habitual activities carried on in the village, and so it is using a factual copula. So the data that you are going to see from now on, they were gathered during 2 fieldworks that I have conducted in 2017 and 2018. I've taken ethnographic notes and conducted semi-structured interviews on the language habits and attitudes of the community. And we will see some data on the lexicon and I elicit vocabulary through pictures and list of words, and also made use of spontaneous speech data. So oral narrative, one it was recorded with a colleague in 2018, and one is from 2002 from the project Interactive Inner Asia. So just here just would like to outline some ideas and concepts on endangerment and ethno-linguistic vitality. So we know from the most famous frameworks on endangerment that linguistic vitality and endangerment is measured through different factors. They can be the number of the speakers, the use of the language in education or in the media, the institutional policies, the community members' attitudes, the quality of documentation. We know that also these frameworks are kind of universal, but then when it comes to see a particular situation, we see that there are different results according to the linguistic and social context of the community. So in the literature, we can see some studies that actually emphasize the importance of a social institution, shared beliefs, the possibility of the community to see themselves as a group, also pride of its own cultural values. But other works, as for example in Mufwana, we see that, for example, what is more important is the usefulness, the communicative function of the language, the fact that the language is spoken in a multilingual environment. And for example, in his works, Mufwana says that factors that are usually valued as very important, like loss of pride and lack of literacy, are not actually so important. So let's see what happens for Wutun. No, first let's see what happens in general in Amdo. So the main problem in Amdo is that, so we have some minority languages like Tibetan that are actually officially recognized. And so they are actually the official languages of some autonomous area. So they can actually enjoy language rights. But others, especially languages that are nor Chinese nor Tibetan, they don't have language rights because they don't have a formal recognized territory, and they are also lower in prestige hierarchies. So this means that people, they don't value the language and they prefer to switch to Tibetan and or to Chinese as a way to get a better social position. If we look at the data from UNESCO, these are some endangered languages like Salar, Turkic, Bonanen, Minhe, Mongol, Mongolic, Tangwan, that is a Chinese language. They range actually between vulnerable and severely endangered. We have also some ethnographic observations on some languages. For example, for Salar, we know that there is indifference towards the language. For Bonan, there was an interesting study that studied language attitudes in two different villages speaking the same language. And so in one village, actually people were very proud of their language, but finally they didn't want to transmit it to their children. And in another village, people were actually indifferent. They had the neutral attitudes, but finally they were transmitting that to the children. So for the same language, the same social situation, we can see still different results. So for Wutun, it's never been written. And even though some other languages, like for example, Salar, were given some orthographic system that finally were not successful, Wutun has never been provided with an orthographic standard. And people are kind of fine with it because they also speak and write other languages. So for example, when it comes to write a text message, they can write it in Chinese, they can write it in Tibetan. If they really want to speak Wutun, they can send an audio message. It's very common practice in China and in the area. What is negative is that, for example, in these last years, there has been an increasing interest in local narratives on the local history of the area. And so people from the village that, for example, have a master's degree decide to interview people and to write a book. But when it comes to write and to publish the book is written in Tibetan. So we don't have the original narrative, actually. The language attitudes range from negative and positive. People describe the language as a dialect because they acknowledge that it doesn't have a written standard, no literary production. It is spoken only in the village. Also, it has this kind of Chinese and Tibetan features that it's not seen as positive in the area. If we look at different languages in Northwest China, what is important for the minority language is purism. So the the most poor you are, the more the language is beautiful. So it is not good to speak a kind of mixed language in the area. Also, the Tibetans that live in the area, they recognize these kind of mixed features of the people and the language. So they are called Dordo. I don't know what does it mean, but it's a name that is used to refer to Wutun speakers, but also to the Mongolic speaking people in the area. Or they call them in Tibetan Chamewot, that means neither Chinese nor Tibetan. And so what is positive about the language from the point of view of the community is that the language, since it's a mix of Tibetan and Chinese, it is actually related to claim of origin from Central Tibet. So in this area, having origin from Central Tibet is very fancy. And especially if you have paternal ancestry for Central Tibet, it's an element of Tibetanness and purity of descent. So this claim, this narrative claim that people originated when Tibetan soldiers from Central Tibet settled down during the Tibetan kingdom, and they married Tibetan, Mongolic, and Chinese women. But finally, at the end, according to some historical sources and local gazette, we know that is actually the opposite. So Wutun speakers are most probably descendants of Chinese soldiers that during the next dynasty, the Ming, the Qing, they work as garrisons in the area and married local women. And then we will see in the part of the lexicon how these narratives are actually connected to the vocabulary of the language. So about the social and economic situation of this rural area, it is a place of social and economic interaction because this area, the village lives of agriculture and tanka painting that I showed you before. So it is not a village that is experiencing a strong mass migration. Tanka is the object of a revival, both within the community, because it is an art that is known in the whole Tibetosphere, and so making this kind of arts actually links them to other parts of Tibet, so it's a source of pride. But also the government is interested in founding this art because it's promoting Tibetan tourism. And so there are poverty alleviation measures that, for example, they give financial help for organic agriculture, organic livestock, and also for kinds of crafts, and also for tanka painting. So people from the younger generation, they can, for example, be trained in tanka painting in the village, so they don't have to immigrate. Sometimes they have the possibility to work in the center of the prefecture, Longbu, that I showed you in the map before. It is like 5 minutes by car, and so they can live there or live in the village and then work in administration, education, in the health services of this small urban area. So also the development of infrastructures has been a factor in the development of this area. I told you before that the village is distant from Shinin 150 kilometers. 2 years before, getting from the capital to the village, it took more than 4 hours. Because the route was following the Yellow River. So now there is a highway that connects the capital with the Wutun village in 2 hours. And so, of course, it has positive and negative factors. Positive because people can work in the city and go to see their family, so that but at the same time, they're bringing with them new language habits. So we have to follow in the next years how the village cope with this poverty alleviation measures, and also with the fact that it's more and more close to the urban centers of the area. Okay, so this was about the sociolinguistic context. Just a few words on the linguistic repertoire of the community. So people usually speak Wutun in informal communication in the village. Also, when they train people from the village in tanka painting, they speak Wutun with, of course, some Tibetan long words related to technical words. And also people move from the village, and so they speak Wutun with their family in other urban centers and in Chinin. Then we have also Northwest Mandarin, that is a vehicular language in the area. They use it to for interaction with Hui people, so the Chinese Muslim, Han people, Salar people, who are Turkic people, but they also speak Chinese. Northwest Mandarin is important because it is an important role for the local identity. So it is good also to make business with people. Then the other language, the other vehicular language is Amdo Tibetan, that is spoken by Tibetan and by the other Tibetanized communities, as for example, the Paunan people, the Mongolic people I've just mentioned. Amdo Tibetan can be also the language of instruction. There is an elementary school in the rural area. We have also middle schools in the urban center close to the village. So compared to other areas, I don't know if you are familiar, but for example, in the Tibetan Autonomous Region or in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region, a real bilingual education with the minority language as the language of instruction is almost being destroyed. In Qinghai, education in Amdo Tibetan is also possible. So people like Wutun can be bilingual in Chinese and also in Amdo. Then also as a Tibetanized community that identify itself as Tibetans, they are also in contact with other varieties. For example, modern literary Tibetan, because if they are educated, they can read a novel. Lhasa Tibetan, for example, for TV programs or music. And also some of them, some young adults, they can get a religious training in a monastery for, I don't know, in summer, for a couple of months. And so in this way, they also learn classical Tibetan. And then last, Standard Chinese, that as in Northwest China is the language of social mobility. It is the language of the media. In each household in the village, there is a television. People, sometimes they prefer to watch programs in Chinese rather than in Tibetan, because Tibetan television is sometimes all about folklore, while Chinese programs are more competitive. There is some famous VIP, and so they just prefer to watch something in Chinese. And also, as I told you before, so the village is kind of wealthy because of this production of tanka painting. And so many families can afford university for their children. And so young generation get a university degree in Chinese, and also they come back to the village with a very proficient level of the standard language. So this was to give you an idea of the whole sociolinguistic context and contact, linguistic repertoire. So now I would like to show you some features of the lexicon and connect them again with vitality and language contact. So what we will see are some Wutun local features, some idiosyncratic terms, features that are shared with other Northwest Mandarin varieties spoken in the area. We will see the impact of the Tibetan vocabulary. We know that Tibetan vocabulary is a source of cultural terms, but sometimes we can find it also in some areas of the lexicon that are usually categorized as core vocabulary, so not really prone to borrowing, but still we find some Tibetan words. And also, as Chinese, the presence of Chinese is considerable in other languages spoken in the area, we will also see what is the impact of Standard Chinese in the language. So let's see some tables. So here you can see this adjective, ga. It is a Northwest Mandarin adjective. We don't find it in Standard Chinese, but just in Northwest Mandarin. It means small, but with an emotional and informal nuance. When we want to use small for an objective description, we use xiao, that is also used in standard Chinese. And this adjective is very productive in the language. So you can see that is used to name animals, number 1, for kinship terms in 4 and 5. Also, number 3, we have an ad hoc construction. So ga means small. Lamala is a derivational suffix, and it refers to things or people that share the same characteristic. So small plus lamala makes kids. And we find this construction also for other words in the language. If we look at the kinship terms, we can see that most of them are of a Chinese origin. So some of them, as number 3, apa, 5, aje, age, they are actually Northwest Mandarin terms. We can find it also in other varieties of Chinese spoken in the area. What is interesting is that some varieties of Chinese, for example, the dialects spoken in Xining in the capital, are actually moving to the standard Chinese word for kinship terms, while in Wutun they still keep these words with this prefix a. But if we look at number 5 and number 10, we can see that we have some Tibetan words. So I don't know if I have to tell you, but WT is written Tibetan. And so this is because of lack of differences between the Wutun kinship terms, so the Chinese one and the Tibetan one. So Nemo and Shenmo are terms for younger sister. One is said by the older sister and one is said by the older brother. Wutun doesn't have this feature, and so they borrow it from Tibetan. Differences in categorization, again, can be found for the anatomy field. Most of them are from Chinese. Number 5, we can see a mixed word. Tamutibon is tam in Chinese plus tam in Tibetan. It's a repetition. But 7 and 8, we can see 2 Tibetan loanwords. So Wutun as a word to say arm, number 6, but it's like the whole arm. And then they use the Tibetan words to make reference to the upper arm and the lower part of the arm. So these are again differences in the segmentation of the body. Then we have also some mixed predicates for those who are interested in verbs. So here we have from 1 to 4 OV object-verb constructions, where the basic verb is from Chinese, and then the object is from Tibetan. So again, we see Tibetan as a source for cultural vocabulary. An example, number 1, tuo kyodili, that means to dance. Literally means to jump the dance. And so we have tuo, that is the Tibetan from the traditional dance, and then to jump, that is from Chinese. Then we have samagun, saman is from Tibetan, and gun means boil, and together it means to cook. Also, example number 5, it's pretty particular. So we have the verb to say in Tibetan, and then it is attached to a marker of actionality that we find also in standard Chinese as an intensifier, da. So to say plus to hit, it means to talk big. So we have also some mixed terms and the neologism, and I like to connect this with the vitality of the language. For example, the language as a word for ambulance, that is, I mean, it wasn't common in the past, it's becoming common now. And so they make it for a mixed word. So Mamba is the Tibetan for doctor, and Chicho is the Chinese for car. What is interesting is that they could borrow the term from Tibetan and from Chinese, which would be something that we can expect for a minority language, or maybe to to copy the structure of the Tibetan or the Chinese terms, but they didn't, because in Chinese and Tibetan, ambulance is like a first aid car, and they translate it as the car of the doctor. So it's a very original neologism. So now I just would like to show you some standard Chinese borrowings, as in different minority languages in Northwest China. You can see that it's the language of modernity because we have terms related to education or to technical appliances. The first one, sofa, it's something that it doesn't belong to the normal way to furnish the apartment, because in this area they use a kind of heated platform to sit down and to relax. And something interesting is that, Wutun is a minority language that is a Chinese language, and so we can actually recognize when we have a local word and when we have a standard Chinese borrowing. And this is because of some particular features. So for example, Wutun has the initial velar nasal, and standard Chinese doesn't have it anymore. So for example, a basic word like tooth has this initial velar sound, so nyacha, but the long word with a modern word like toothpaste, tooth doesn't have the velar nasal. Also, the language conserves velarity. So the traditional term for boiled water is gung hui with a velar sound, and the standard Chinese borrowing is kai shui. So so water is traditionally in the archaic version hui, and in the standard Chinese long word with the retroflex like shui. So it's interesting to see what will happen in the future if the language continues to keep these features of its switch to also standard Chinese sounds. So we know that when we have borrowings, we have also reorganization of the lexicon. So for example, for book and for classroom, Tibetan and Chinese words are synonyms, but we have sometimes semantic narrowings. So for example, Yegen is the general word for teacher in Tibetan. Laoshe is the general word for teacher in Chinese. And in Wutun, Yegen, the Tibetan word, refers to a teacher in religion or Tibetan Buddhist art, while Laoshe, the Chinese one, for a teacher in secular education. So this is some examples of Tibetan borrowings. So you can see some kinds of food, precious material like coral and gold. What is interesting, number one and number two, is that what is the modern appliances for the kitchen are from Chinese, while the traditional one, like the stove or the traditional oven, are from Tibetan. So we can see also the different layers of borrowing in the language. As you can imagine, as a Buddhist community, the ritual vocabulary is from Tibetan, even though sometimes we can see, again, some semantic changes. For example, mani is the word for the sacred mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum. It is also the section in the temple with the prayer wheels, and we can find these meanings also in Tibetan. But in Wutun, mani means also sacred text. So if I want to say I am reading a sacred text, I will use the term mani. And still, we still have some idiosyncratic words when it comes to local cults and indigenous rituals. So for those that are not related to like traditional Orthodox Buddhism, for example, the June festival is a festival that is dedicated to the water deities. It's a very famous event in the Wutun village, in the Mongolic speaking villages, and in other Tibetan villages, but just in this area. And to refer to this festival, the people have the Tibetan borrowing, leru, but also a Chinese term, native Chinese term that means the gathering of the 6th month. Also, number 3 is interesting because it's a kind of syncretism. So the paper cuttings, this one that you can see on the door, this tradition is found among Chinese and Tibetan community, but these are typical Tibetan. You can see also the wheel, the Tibetan wheel. But so these are Tibetan, the material is Tibetan, but the word is actually Chinese. And just now we're almost done. So I just would like to reconnect with the Central Tibetan origins of the community and give you an example of how the community uses its lexicon as a language ideology to claim that they come from Central Tibet. So first of all, they said that their language is a mix of not only Chinese and Tibetan, but also the language of the Tan, so the language of Central Tibet. And the evidence are actually the syllable ba, that in Amdo is realized as wa. This is an innovation that we find in the Amdo region. On the contrary, in Lhasa and also in Wutun, the syllable is pronounced pa. And also we have some Tibetan words that are not shared with Amdo Tibetan, but instead are found in the Lhasa dialect. So, for example, ponytail, Central Tibetan is ralba, in Amdo Tibetan is ralwa, but in Wutun is ralba. So the fact that they pronounce in Lhasa Tibetan style is for them an evidence of their origins. Of course, I'm not a Tibetologist, and so I can't trace back the origins of the language. It goes beyond my expertise, but so it's interesting as a language ideology that the people know the differences between different varieties of Tibetan, and they use them to construct their history and also the history of the integration in the area. So some final remarks. So we have seen that Wutun has some elements of endangerment. So we don't have an orthographic system. We don't have any kind of official recognition or social institution. It is not used in the media. It is not used in education. Language attitudes so appear not to be negative, but not even positive, because they see their language as a dialect, as something that doesn't have any importance, but at the same time they use it in the self-identification of the community, and still it has a communicative role in the village. And the village is a place where people speak and interact, so it is spoken and transmitted. A look at Lexicon has shown us that Tibetan is the source of cultural vocabulary. It is often used to fill the gaps in the recipient language. We have seen some particularities of the language, as for example, the prefix a for kinship terms, idiosyncratic terms for local rituals, neologism, mixed word. And so despite the fact that the population identifies itself with as Tibetan, and the pressure of two important languages in the area that are Standard Chinese and Tibetan, these processes have not led to intense borrowing or to relaxification. And so we can still see that the lexicon actually embodies this kind of linguistic and cultural diversity of the community. And so we could also relate this to the fact that this language is spoken in a multilingual environment. What is interesting about the Amdo area is that, of course, we have languages that are endangered, and we have low status languages, very strong situation of diglossia, but still there is still multilingualism. And so, so this could probably have a role in the vitality of the language. And so yes, we have to follow this in the next years, because we know that China is shifting its language policy. So from a state, at least in theory actually supports minority language. Many provinces and regions have already shifted to monolingualism. So we will see how this is going to impact the community. And yes, I'm done. Thank you.